and welcome to today's webinar, Pest Control and Audited Facilities, sponsored by MGK. I'm QA Managing Editor Jackie Mitchell, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your schedule to attend. This high-level overview will provide pest control technicians an understanding of their company's responsibilities when servicing food processing and warehousing accounts in both conventional and organic facilities, with recommended treatment options, including fogging and baits. Our speaker today is Ryan Neff, Technical Field Representative at MGK. Ryan holds an MS in entomology from Texas A&M University and a Ph.D. in entomology from the University of California, Riverside. Ryan has been with MGK since April 2019. He provides support to those in the residential, commercial, and agricultural industries through technical advice, insect management protocols, and field-based research. I have two quick notes to pass along before we get started. First, I want to pass along a quick disclaimer. The views expressed in presentations made during this virtual event are those of the speaker and not necessarily the QA Media Group or GIE Media. Presentations during the virtual event or the participation of vendors during the virtual event do not constitute an endorsement of the vendor or speaker's views, products, or services. Next, I want to remind everyone that our webinar is interactive and we encourage everyone to ask their questions throughout. You can do this by typing them into the Q&A interface, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And we'll hold those questions until the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ryan.
Appreciate it. I'm just going to jump right in since I've got, I had to edit this down from about 90 slides to 60, so hopefully I get through these nice and quick. Just some background. Before I joined MGK, I worked for a pest control company in out of Northern California near Sacramento for about 4 years, and I primarily worked with food processing facilities or raw commodities storage and warehousing and stuff like that. So I had about 4 years of background in that, and I learned just enough to be able to give this presentation today. I will say this: whenever I first started, FSMA was drilled into my head, and just over and over doing like the AIB courses and all that stuff. And I definitely, from a food, from like the plant manager or from the facility standpoint, FSMA is gigantic, and you have all kinds of regulations and standards that you have to follow. But the more I dug into it, in terms of where does pest control fall on this within FSMA, pest control really is almost never mentioned in the FSMA text itself. It's really it's part of the preventative control measures. Now, when you get into the different auditing groups, whether it's AIB, Silicor, SQF, things like that, they will have very specific guidelines for whether it's rodent bait stations or how often traps need to be checked, how far they're spaced, things like that. Yeah, individual auditing bodies have their standards for that. But as far as pest control and FSMA, for everything that I heard at the beginning, the main point of it is, well, pest control's part of those preventative control measures, and that's kind of where they leave it. There's no elaboration to pest control beyond that. Now, in terms of like a HACCP program, those principles, the same principles that are in that HACCP program, honestly, that's pretty similar. Like whether you're monitoring for, foreign objects in food, or whether you're, doing, checking for listeria, things like that. That whole, all 7 of those principles, they can be applied to pest control too. That's really this. If you took this out, or if you put it in a different context and you looked at the principles of integrated pest management, or IPM, it would look very, very similar to those HACCP principles. So even though pest control is not outlined in this, those HACCP principles still, like, it's a good thing for us to follow from the pest control or the service standpoint. So as part of one of those prerequisite programs, pest control helps provide the basic environmental operating conditions for safe food production. And again, like even though pest control is a foundation of a solid HACCP program, the systems themselves don't specify how to run that. But if, even though we don't have that, what can we do? Well, we can do hazard analysis. So based on historical data and current conditions, what pests are likely to occur and where, what regulations or auditing guidelines, et cetera, must you comply with? Monitoring, and you'll hear me harp on this, constantly, because monitoring, I mean, outside of sanitation, monitoring is probably the most important part, because especially if you're in raw commodities, you can get away with it sometimes depending on how the commodities are held. But if you're in the actual finished product area, you can't just go in and spray anything in there. You can't treat some of those areas where the bugs are occurring. And so monitoring to figure out, all right, when are these blowing up and where are these bugs occurring? Can we shut something down really quick, take care of the issue without having to, shut down the entire facility? Maybe we can just shut down one part of that facility. That way we don't interrupt production or something like that. And then verification and validation, that the monitoring allows you to do that. And I run into this constantly where, everybody, you want to get the most bang for your buck. So if somebody's going to come in there and do, I mean, heaven forbid they have to do a fogging, and I'll get into fogging. I know it's a band-aid on a broken leg, but in some cases, if you're trying to pass an audit and you got to knock down some Indian meal moth adults, that's just the way it is. But in some cases, when you're going through and you're doing certain treatment strategies, like let's say you implemented mating disruption, if you're not monitoring, if you don't have devices out there to check that, then you have no way of knowing. You're just kind of throwing stuff up against the wall and hoping it sticks, because you have no way to verify or validate that my treatment actually did what I intended it to do. You can kind of do the feels thing where you walk around the plant and, all right, well, I don't see anything flying around. I don't see anything crawling around, so it must be good. But without trapping or without doing that monitoring, you're really, you're kind of flying dark on that one. I'm going to skip over this, but I was a little glib on this, where, what does this have to do with third-party auditing in terms of like pest control? The real answer is nothing. When you get into, and I should have said this, what does it have to do with FSMA? And I have already kind of beaten that dead horse, so I'll skip over that. But all of these different auditing groups, this is actually where the pest control, like this is where it gets to where, if I'm going in and I'm I'm trying to get one of your facilities on account, and I go in, the first thing I need to ask is, well, who are your auditing bodies? Are you organic? All kinds of things, because that dictates, one, how I'm going to bid this in the first place, because I need to look overhead. I need to see your entire, like the satellite view of your place, so I can sit there and map out, all right, I need devices on either sides of these doors. I need them every 50 feet. I have to be able to plan that out. And which auditing groups that you're beholden to really dictates that. And they fall into different, or at least the concerns of different facilities, it can vary. I would say in general, rodents is probably the number one thing that we get asked about. In MGK, we don't make any rodenticides or anything like that. But just from the pest control standpoint, a lot of times what we would get called in for would be for rodents. Stored product pests would be a very close second. Because rodents, in general, you're probably not going to see. And now I will say this: I've been to a couple of places where a grain auger got turned on and roof rats just come falling out of it. But outside of kind of horror cases like that, most of the time rodents, the only thing you're going to see would be droppings. Whereas if an auditor walks in and you've got Indian meal moth flying around, or if you got cigarette beetles all over the place, or red flower beetles, that is much more obvious. Or in other cases, maybe you have different types of flying insects, maybe small flies, house flies, drain flies, things like that. But stored product pests is a really major one, and I'll talk about what makes stored product pests unique. Kind of get into this a little bit more, because whether you're doing raw commodities, warehousing and storage, the actual food processing or manufacturing, or the finished products and retail. Again, that dictates where you're looking at. In some cases, if you're doing, say, raw commodities, uh, maybe in general, there can be places or areas that along that supply chain, you're not really worried about whether you've got insect activity or not, because maybe there's through, some other process in the supply chain, there's a kill step, or it goes through I forget what it's called. It's like the scintillator or something. It's that thing that spins really quick and just mashes up anything that's in the uh, the grain or the product itself. So if you've got these different steps along the way that can get rid of or take or mitigate the risk of insects getting in there, then in some of those areas you don't really need it. But that's part of the process of the QA supervisor for the pest control company, or if you're doing this internally for your internal pest control people, that's the thing you have to try to take into account and figure out, all right, which areas do I need to monitor, which are the most important areas, because you get a gigantic facility, and I'll show you some examples of like just parts of facilities that previously when I've worked with a company where we map it out, the number of devices is, I mean, staggering. And obviously every part of that place is theoretically important, but there are going to be hot spots, and if you can use your monitoring to focus on those hot spots, that really it saves a lot of time, energy, and you get to use that phrase from earlier, more bang for your buck if you can identify those areas. So in these types of areas, you've got typically the person servicing a food processing facility is that's not just your standard pest control technician that would show up and treat your house and move the dog dishes and do all that stuff. This is, in general, the people that are servicing those food production services are people that have very good attention to detail, or substantially more attention to detail than their counterparts. They've been in pest control for a while, and I've never seen a case where a company, where there's been a third party audited facility on service that somebody got hired and they threw that person out there. It's somebody that's got experience in pest control, because it's a very involved process. And I mean, not just from a detail standpoint, but I mean, it's the wear and tear on your body from going around, and if you've got 400 exterior rodent stations at a facility that's over several square miles, like that's a lot of walking around, a lot of bending down. Like it's not an easy job at all. So these aren't just the run of the mill technicians. And in a lot of cases, and we had this across a lot of the branches at my old company, where if it's a big enough company, you've got one technician dedicated to that place. So that's their entire route, is dealing with one particular company. Again, that all depends. So when the folks come out to your facilities, what are they doing? So again, it depends on regulatory compliance. FDA facilities, in some cases, you've got the FDA just there constantly. And then third party audited groups. Primary focus, again, exterior, interior rodent management and stored product pests would be a big one. And if anybody on this call is thinking, well, I've got a big fly issue or German cockroach issue, I get it. And that definitely is a big part of this. I'm just saying, in terms of, if I've been to every facility that I've been to, the most common issues tend to arise around rodents, and then stored product pests is a close second. And then add-on services depending on the facility type and problem. I've got a couple of great examples I could bring up on this for like midge control and some other things, but I'll get into that if I have time. And then the services, it varies. Sometimes it's broken up weekly. At the bare minimum, and I'll go over it briefly here in a bit, because it depends on the third party group. But that service frequency is going to be outlined. And then let's say it's monthly. In some cases, maybe a technician will divide it up by building if the facility is big enough, or maybe they'll go out and they'll service the exterior stations one week, and then they'll come back and do the interior stations another week, and then they'll do the fly lights another time, or they can break it up in different ways. So those third party accounts, they're going to be the largest accounts at a company. Sometimes an entire staff can be devoted, or an entire route can be devoted to it. In some cases, like some of the facilities I've worked with, I've ended up interacting with their on-staff entomologists. So again, depending on the company, they can get really in the weeds in terms of all the QA folks that are associated with that production facility. And they're under an extreme amount of scrutiny. If you looked at, say, a residential pest control service where you've got somebody, showing up to your house, either power spraying or putting on a backpack, treating, knocking down webs, and then they leave the bill with you, or they, email or however they do it. Maybe if somebody's upset, they call the service manager, and the service manager has to deal with it. In these large accounts like this, oftentimes you've got several commercial supervisors dealing with it. They may even bump it up to the branch manager in some cases. So some of these facilities, you've got a lot of eyes on them, and you've got a lot of bodies that are associated with it. So it can get big fast. And this is exactly what I was talking about earlier. This is just part of a facility. And we've got the buildings outlined over here. You've got all the exterior stations. You've got all these interior devices. You can see where there are pheromone traps all around here. Mating disruptions been put up. So again, from a pest control standpoint, this is a daunting task. Like this is an incredible amount of work, and collecting all the data from all of these stations is, I know it, I've been in cases where maybe the technician kind of gets thrown under the bus. It's like, oh, well, you didn't do this that day. It's like, man, if you're already, say you've had a rough week, and Friday afternoon, like you show up and this is what or Friday morning you show up and this is what you're doing, like it can wear on you. So, I'm not saying just, discard it completely, but it's a difficult job. So, have a little sympathy for some of those folks. I've talked about rodent baiting, monitoring and identifying infestations early, because insecticides are really only going to be applied on an as needed basis. Again, this isn't like a residential service where somebody's coming out and doing a kind of barrier treatment around your home to make sure spiders and other exterior vermin or insects don't get in. This is, all right, we're monitoring everything, and if something pops up, then we will start treating accordingly. But it's going to be treating with a purpose. It's not, in general, it's not just all right, well, I guess now we're going to go spray all around the interior of the facility. It's no, if we've got flying insects like Indian meal moth or whatever, we're going to do, say, a fogging treatment, because we know we've got an audit coming up in a couple of days, and we need something that we can knock it out, and we also got to get those air exchanges through so we can get people back in here working really quick. If it's gel baits for an ongoing roach issue, every once in a while you get like a seasonal ant control. But again, that's more of a seasonal and case by case basis. It's not prevalent like rodents and stored product pests. So an example service, I already talked about this a little bit, where you got like week 1 exterior rodent, week 2 interior, week 3 fly lights and pheromones, and week 4 maybe you're just doing a general inspection and adding all of your conducive conditions to your report. So monthly service, if you're not subdividing it like that, if the facility's small enough, or if you've got the time, you can pull this off. But it's really tough to get through all of those devices. Like, again, you saw that map I put up earlier. Good luck getting through all of that in a single day. That's going to be a very long day. And there may be some, supervisors from pest control companies on this call. I can only see my screen. I can't see who's on the call right now, but if there are, there might be some in there that are like, nah, I could have done that. And, kudos to you, but in general, that's a lot of stuff to get through. So when you're talking about exterior rodent stations, it's really, I mean, it's bait stations or multi-catch in general. I'm out in California, so they've got some very, we'll call them peculiar um, regulations involving baiting in particular, and they're trying to, you know, do some stuff with glue boards too. But I digress. With those, the exterior portion of that service, it's really just rodent control. Nobody's going around and spraying the building on a regular basis. They can if you've got issues, but that's not going to be part of the regular service. And in those cases, opportunities for exterior barrier treatments or ant control, they exist. But from the facility's perspective, if that pest control company tells you, hey, you know, we can install like, you know, these rodent exclusion devices or material, there's stuff we can put in here, that's the way to go, because that kind of knocks it out completely. That's a really big part of rodent management, is doing proper exclusion. You know, you can put out snap traps, or you can bait until till the cows come home, but in most cases you're just going to be harvesting stuff on the exterior. It's really, if there's no signs of infestation on the interior, that's what you're looking for. Because, and I've gotten in, we'll call them discussions bordering on arguments with auditors, where let's say that we had a lot of bait that was eaten at a very specific, near a very specific door in a facility. And the auditor's looking through that report and they say, well, look at this. You've got a ton of rodent activity here. What's going on? Said, yeah, I mean, a lot of rodents appear to be eating that bait. But if you look at any of the conducive conditions on the interior, there's no sign of a rodent infestation. There's no droppings. We have no trap catches. If you look around the doors, everything is sealed properly. There's no entryway for them. And that's one of the, it's one of the bad things about monitoring in general when you're talking to an auditor, because some auditors that I've dealt with, they they understand it's preventative. So you're collecting all of this data and you're going to use it to make an informed decision. And even if there are insects captured on a glue board, or if there's rodent activity on the exterior, just because there's activity doesn't mean that there's actually a problem. It might mean that, but if you're looking and you're seeing a couple of trap catches on a, you know, somewhere way away from anywhere where the bug is actually going to infest the material and lead to, you know, product being recalled or something like that, then you really don't have a problem. You know it's there, and if you see the issue keep building up, yeah, you could do something. But sometimes auditors will look at that and just say, hey, there's activity here, and I don't see, you know, I didn't see what you did about it, so I'm going to, you know, dock you a point or whatever it is. Those are, you know, good luck convincing somebody that they're wrong about that. But, you know, it's, the argument can still be made that, you know, it's part of that preventative service. This part, and that's actually what I'm talking about, where the raw commodities, you know, and for something, say like walnuts, they'll put all those walnut hulls in these giant rows. I don't know how tall, it feels like it's 20 feet tall by, I don't know, like 60, 80 yards, something like that. Really, really large areas where they, you know, have these, all of these holes, and then they're going to end up selling this off for, you know, it'll become, I don't know, kitty litter or whatever the heck that they end up selling it off for. But a lot of those places like that, they'll have a bunch of red flower beetles. And so maybe on one section of the facility, on your devices on the exterior, or even on some of the devices on the interior, you might see high numbers of red flower beetles. But if there's no, if that's not introducing an infestation into, say, the finished goods area, or if it's not presenting an immediate threat to food contamination, but you're keeping an eye on it, then that's what you're looking for. You know, again, so that even though you've got those red flower beetles there, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem. It just means you're keeping on top of it and you understand what the issues at that facility might be. So again, the data collection, I really want to harp on I'll get to the pheromone traps here in a second, but that's one thing I've always struggled with, is you can't monitor, you can't make decisions on something that if you don't know it's there. And that'll just be a little foreshadowing before we get to there. So when a technician arrives, he's going to usually check in, front office, point of contact, whatever, if you require hairnets, bump caps, you know, visible vests, things like that. A lot of facilities are going to have very specific things that they want you to do. They're going to they're going to inspect the devices, change out glue boards if they have to, change out bait, maybe change out pheromone lures, things like that. They'll note conducive conditions. And then, I put the binder in quotes. It used to be a giant binder that they would leave at the facility, and that may still be the case. I know a lot of companies though have moved on to a virtual binder, so it'll be a portal that you can go into and look at all your trap catch data and look at all the conditions that a technician's put in. So I'm going to skip a little bit over the rodent management part, just because one, MGK doesn't do anything with rodents, and two, that's I don't want to get into that. Let somebody from like Bell or Leafitech or somebody else really hone in on that. I will just use it to put across that some of those bodies, they don't allow for any baits to be used on the inside of facilities. And that was the case. Like, I think we only had one case and it was just for a rodent infestation that was so bad, we worked with the auditing body to say, hey, we need to implement this control strategy for X number of days. Then it'll all be pulled out. So you can petition them sometimes, but in general, that they don't allow for use in facilities. Most common spacing every 20 to 40 feet. Really, only AIB Primus and Silica explicitly list the measurements. And then other groups base it on the result of a risk assessment. And this is what I would prefer, because again, if you looked at all of those devices on the map that I showed earlier, if a company's been servicing your account for 4, 5, 10 years and you've never gotten any hits on, say, a fifth of the devices in like the northwest corner of your building, well, maybe take out the bulk of those devices, put a couple more in there, like just leave a few in there. That way, if something does pop up eventually, you can kind of see it. But that way you're not wasting time, because a lot of that time could be used, say, doing inspections on the interior, or spending more time in the places where you're actually encountering issues. So exterior, they really don't specify pieces of equipment. It's every 25, 50 feet, both sides of the door, and you got to service them at least every month. Now, for pheromones, this is, and I don't understand why this is, maybe because not every facility is, subject to having a stored product pest infestation, but I'll go into facilities sometimes and they've got a massive cigarette beetle or red flower beetle problem. And you're like, oh, are you monitoring for these? And you go in and you just see the Indian meal moth, or like the hanging pheromone traps that catch about 5 different species of moths. It's like, okay, I'm glad you have these out here, but you're not going to collect any of those beetles. Yeah, you might get some on a fly light here and there. You might get some on the glue boards inside the tin cats that are used for mice on the interior of that facility. But if you're not using, say, a pheromone trap designed for beetles, you're not going to catch any beetles. So, and this is where, and I'll just be the inside baseball on this, where I disagree with that. But like I said, with those auditors, every once in a while, you'll get one that just says, hey, you were catching these insects and you didn't, fog, or you didn't do anything. So you're not being proactive about it. So if you're not monitoring for it, then technically you're not going to have any trap catches, and maybe an auditor that's not really looking thoroughly or is not that concerned with the pest control aspect, that may gloss right over them. Now, can that bite you in the rear? Yeah, because if you're not monitoring for something that builds up over time, and then all of a sudden you have a bunch of product that gets recalled because you have either, rice weevils, or you've got sawtooth grain beetles in there. That's an issue. But again, with those pheromone devices, if you're not if you're not monitoring for both beetles and the moths, you're really missing out, because even though Indian mealmoth is probably the biggest, most universally put out there stored product pest that you would encounter, cigarette beetle is a very close second. I run into cigarette beetles almost as often as I run into Indian mealmoth. Red flower beetles are way up there too. Um, and for pheromone devices, this is a case where, yeah, on the exterior, I was telling you where, all right, if you got a bunch of rodent bait stations in the northwest corner, and they haven't had a hit in 5 or 10 years, maybe it's time to only leave a couple out there and focus elsewhere. Kind of the same thing for the stored product pest, but depending on the type of facility you're running, like if you've got um, racking and you've got product stored on racks all over a giant warehouse, you want zeros on there, because if I only put a few of those out there and they're all getting filled up, that's great, but that doesn't give me any information on where the infestation is occurring. You've got to have some zeros in there, or very, very low numbers. That way you can start identifying where those hotspots are. Again, if you put 4 devices in a 500,000 square foot warehouse, that's not going to tell you any information. You've really got to have it spaced out appropriately. And I would say definitely every 50 feet. If you've got a lot of product coming in and out and you're regularly running into problems, every 25 feet is not a bad idea either. And I know, well, like that's helped me out in a couple of facilities where it was one of the first ones I did by myself, where we had a cigarette beetle issue. All of this warehousing material, like raw commodities, stored in tote bags all over the place. And we had a massive infestation, but there were only a few devices in there, so we couldn't really pinpoint it. So we ended up putting in a lot more devices, and we were able to identify a couple of racks where it was likely to occur, get on a scissor lift, get up there, and finally figure out that, you're supposed to do, was it first in, first out, or first in, I always forget what the thing is, but there was a product that was kind of on the back of the top rack that hadn't been pulled out in a long time. It hadn't gone through that process. And there was water that had leaked on it from like a leak in the roof, and it had become moldy. And that was the source of all the cigarette beetles. So again, without having those devices in there in a way that we could kind of narrow it down to a certain area, we couldn't make heads or tails of it. And there wasn't any way that they were going to let us go in there and just look through every single, rack, because there just wasn't enough time for it. We would have disrupted their process way too much. So yeah, that whole thing about monitoring is it's just used to determine if infestation is inside the facility, is it being shipped from another site, where in the facility, if it's coming from in there, is it occurring? And this point here about it being shipped in from another site, that is really important, especially if it's like if you've got like a vertically integrated facility where they own maybe they own the farmland and they own the raw commodity, like, the farm to the facility, and then it's getting shipped from there to the other facility that's going to create the finished goods. You want to know, all right, do I have an active infestation that's constantly coming from my finished goods site, or is all of my issue being shipped in from that other side? Because that immediately allows you to say, all right, well, if I don't have recurring issues, if I don't have hotspots inside this finished good area, that means whatever I'm doing is preventing them from gaining a real good foothold, and I can focus all of my attention on trying to prevent those insects from coming in, from that other site. So when you're monitoring for them, how do you figure out which ones to use? I think there's Trace, there's a couple other companies that do this stuff. You use whatever you want. These are just the images I pulled off the internet, but in all of these cases, like, these are pheromones for moths and for some of the beetles. And then there's a feeding stimulant or a feeding attractant for other species. So again, these dome traps, these catch a bunch of different types of beetles, and it's the same idea. There's some of those beetles in there, there's an actual pheromone attractant. And then for others that don't have a specific pheromone, there's a feeding lure in there where when they get within a pretty short range of it, they recognize, ooh, there's something over here, and they'll run in and go feed it, and it'll catch a bunch of different types. And this is what I'm talking about when, or like having that overall monitoring program is, in addition to having those hang for moths, and you can get ones that monitor for beetles as well. You do want some ones on the ground for those insects that aren't flying. Like if you have a massive sawtooth beetle infestation, they're never going to wind up in those hanging traps, but they will wind up in these dome traps that you put on the ground. And then you want to grid out that facility, and you got to have a really well maintained map. And I'll show you what this looks like when you actually use the data that you're collecting, what it looks like or what you can do with it in practice. So again, if I'm monitoring for all these pests, let's just say, an auditor was looking at this, or somebody was trying to gauge how the program did. Well, if you've got, let's just say it's all occurring over in this area, and that's where my primary Indian meal moth issue is. Well, I can see that over time, maybe I did my application or I did my controlled strategy here in March, and then that number drastically dropped off, and then it kind of starts climbing back up. But this is how you validate, did the material I applied work? Did my control strategy have an effect? And maybe it wasn't even something the pest control company did. Maybe as a facility, you decided to implement a new cleaning schedule, or, augmented it in some way. This is how you validate, did that work or not? So moving on, I know I could go on and on about stored product pests and pheromone traps for a while, so I'll get off of that. But the ILTs, or insect light traps, you generally want those about 10 feet from food contact surfaces, although this can vary. It's really on an as needed basis based on the risk assessment. And ILTs, or the light traps, these aren't going to catch all of your, that's not going to catch all your flies. Let's put it that way. If you put them in certain sensitive areas where you wouldn't normally have many flies getting into, but the ones that do get in there, you're hoping that these ILTs kind of intercept them before they make their way and maybe contaminate food. Or I'm thinking of, now this isn't necessarily, it's not food, but like a paper mill. In certain areas, like, you can't have anything getting in there, because even if you got a few midges that contaminate that paper, when they're doing the or when they're looking at that and they're doing the QA on it, that whole roll will just be tossed, and it's not a cheap thing to do, or thing to have happen. But again, those light traps, it's not a cure-all. It's more of a monitoring tool. It can also do a lot to tell you, like, are doors open, or are they being left open? I've had a number of light traps specifically where I'd look at them, and on there are a bunch of these they're called rove beetles. They're predatory beetles. They're usually flying and eating other small bugs. They're really good flyers. They can fly a pretty decent distance, and they're pretty tiny. So when they show up on a glue board, a lot of folks just think they're small flies. But if I see that, I know immediately, all right, somebody's been leaving a door open, because rove beetles, they don't live on the inside of a facility. They would be eating bugs on the exterior, which means, one, you've got some bugs on the exterior of the facility, and two, somebody's leaving that door open because they're either, going in there because that door's open to look for food, or the negative pressure is sucking them in when they get close enough. So those ILTs, the service frequency, it differs weekly for AIB, NSF, bi-monthly for Silicur, monthly for other ones. The bulbs, really, it's change annually, or whatever the manufacturer says, or whenever they get, knocked into or busted up. Okay, so now that I just went over a lot of the devices that you would use, well, I've mentioned some of the insects, but let's go over the actual insects that are going to be the most problematic. So internal feeders, you're looking at rice weevils right here. Rice weevils, these are most common in the raw commodity area, where you've got or if you've got grain silos, that's where you see a good chunk of these. That's not to say they can't occur elsewhere, but they generally like to get into whole grain products. So that's why you're going to find them on the raw commodities mostly. You very I've seen them in finished goods one time, and it was a really weird instance because it was finished processed macaroni, and inside the boxes I could see rice weevils walking around in there, and I I don't know if they were actually breeding in there or if they just happened to get in there through somehow during the processing. But that was the only time I've ever run into rice weevils in a finished product that was sitting in a box. Granary weevils, very similar to the rice weevil, except they don't fly. But I'll say this: on a lot of these insects, we'll go over these two weevils. One flies, one doesn't. There's going to be a couple of beetles that are the same way. One flies, one doesn't. And actually, these weevils are a type of beetle. But yet, even the ones that fly, you don't typically see them flying around a whole lot. With red flower beetle, you'll see it when they're in massive numbers, especially if you take the walnut holes that I was talking about earlier. You'll see them flying around in those instances. But if it's, say, like a massive, they're putting out, say, bagels and the what do you call them, like the little Starbucks sandwiches, things like that. One of those types of processing facilities, and you've got them in the actual equipment. I don't typically see them flying around too often. So even if they fly, you're probably not going to see them flying that often when you actually encounter them in the field. I've never actually run into the lesser grain borer, and they look a lot like a lead cable borer, which is something that you would see more on the wood destroying insect side. But this is in there, so if anybody's ever dealt with it, I'd love to hear about it because I've never run into these in my experience. Same with these. I've never run into Anglemoid grain moth, and most of the moths are going to feed on. They're either external feeders or they feed on just they're scavengers. But this is one of the few ones that actually feeds on whole kernels of corn, wheat, or other grains and seeds. So let's get into the ones that you really start seeing, especially in like the warehousing and finished goods areas. Drugstore beetle can be a big issue. I've run into these a few times. They and honestly, this is also where I've run into this with a staff entomologist at one of the facilities I went to, where our technician, let's just say you have a drugstore beetle and a cigarette beetle. They look pretty similar. Now, for an entomologist, an entomologist would be able to tell the difference. There's differences in the antennae, the way the head's shaped. And when you see them enough, you'd be able to identify it. Now, some auditors might come through there or an entomologist and say, all right, well, your technician identified these as drugstore beetles and it was a cigarette beetle. So this is unacceptable. I guess when it comes to something like this, being a stickler for the absolute actual ID, yes, I get it. Correct identification is incredibly important because incorrect ID can lead to implementing the wrong control strategy. But in the case of if you misidentified a cigarette beetle as a drugstore beetle or vice versa, the control would be the exact same. So there's no difference in what your approach would be to tackle an issue like this, because you're trying to identify the source of the infestation. If it's some contaminated product or whatever, it's identify that and get it out of there. And remove it. Or if it's in, say you had an expansion joint that no longer has any of the, the epoxy in there, it's just, caked in flour or whatever it is, you can treat certain areas and knock that out. But again, you're not, just because it's a drugstore beetle doesn't change the control tactics if it was a cigarette beetle. Warehouse beetles, these are I would say the most problematic if the larvae were to get into finished products, because, and you can kind of see it here, they have all of these hairs poking up off of them. And I forget what it's called. It's like haustellate or something like that. But with a bug, these aren't actual hairs. It's outgrowths of the exoskeleton, so it's still, it's part of the exoskeleton. And the hairs, they're kind of barbed, and they have I forget what it is on the tip of them, but they're very irritating. So if a normal person encountered this, they, if you got the cast skins on your actual skin, it would feel itchy, and it would be slightly uncomfortable. Now, if this gets into food, if a asthmatic child or somebody that's sensitive ingests this, you can have some pretty serious issues. So you definitely, if you've got a warehouse beetle or any of this group of beetle, like if you've got any issues with them, you definitely want to nip that in the bud, because again, that presents not just a food contamination, like you're eating bugs kind of thing. Those hairs can be a medical issue in cases. Indian meal moth. This is again probably one of the biggest ones. The larvae, they look like they're little caterpillars. They're actually feeding usually in the, like, on around the food itself, but they can they can still be scavengers to some degree. What you'll a lot of times see is when that last instar or that last caterpillar stage is ready to pupate and then become a moth, you'll see them sometimes either crawling up the racking or they'll crawl up the sides of walls. They usually like to pupate in higher areas. And another sign of their infestation, if you've got a real bad Indian meal moth problem, you'll see what look like cobwebs around, maybe the racking or on the walls or just, throughout the facility. And that's silk spun, from these Indian meal moths in a lot of cases. So that can be a sign of an Indian meal moth infestation too. But best way to monitor for these are those pheromone traps. So scavengers, these are red flower beetle, confused flower beetle. Uh, it says 3-segmented club, 4-segmented club. This is another one of those instances where, and I've had this happen too, where a technician identified a red flower beetle as a confused flower beetle, and somebody was like, "Well, this isn't what it actually is." I'm like, okay, great, but they have the exact same life history. They feed in the same areas. Just one disperses through flight, one doesn't. The control strategy is still the same. But yeah, you'll see when I see these, they can be all over the place. You can find them I've seen them in silos. I've seen them, especially like in the machinery. In one facility in particular, they had an area upstairs that was kind of the de facto boneyard. All of the pieces of equipment that maybe it may have been like built into that facility before they put up certain parts of the structure, and now they can't move it out, so they just store it in an area and throw a tarp over it. Well, that was the source of a lot of this infestation, because they didn't clean any of that material out. All of the old machinery and equipment still had a bunch of gummed up product in there, and so that was just a perfect source. They would constantly disperse from that area, and without having pheromone devices around to figure out, okay, well, even when we tackle the problem in other areas of the facility, we still seem to be getting hits on these devices. What's going on here? And that led us to looking into that kind of boneyard. But yeah, those are the places you'll see those. Sawtooth grain beetles, run into these every once in a while. They're really, really tiny. These pictures make it look nice and big, and you'd definitely be able to tell because they call it sawtooth. You can see all the lines on the pronotum there, which is that we'll call it like the bug neck. You can see those 6 spines on either side, but they're really tiny and really, really fast. For those that they can climb, they can get into really tiny holes in packaging, and they've got pretty good mouth parts, like in terms of chewing. So they can get in really, really tiny cracks and crevices that you wouldn't think that a bug would be able to get into. So they can be an issue, but I run into those much less than I do like cigarette beetles. And I've run into med flower moth a few times, but you can catch these on the exact same pheromone traps that you would catch Indian meal moth. And even though they're different species, in general, the control tactics are the same. You're using those pheromone devices to target where are they occurring, and then you're either removing infested product or doing specific treatments in certain areas to get the best control. So I've already talked about the monitoring and maps, and now for the last part, which is chemical control, which is, again, it's if you're doing chemical control in general, you're just kind of kicking the can down the road. If you're doing something like mating disruption for Indian meal moth or for med flower moth, um, that's great. That's going to keep your populations much lower than if you were trying to go through and fog on a regular basis. Um, and a lot of times people ask, well, why is that? Why is fogging not effective? Well, fogging fogging is effective at knocking down adults, but in any given population of insects, it's this doesn't hold true for everything, but I'll just give you like a rough estimate is maybe 10 to 15% are adults, and the other 85 to 90% are in the egg or larval stage. And all of that, the larval stage in general, like it's going to be in the food itself or in the commodity where, all right, with the exception of, say whole grain or certain other things, I can't apply a material there. So if I can't treat where the bulk of the population is living, I'm not really getting to the heart of the issue, which is I've got to tackle that larval population in order to keep that down. Now, theoretically, yeah, you could go through and fog every day and kill all of the adults as they emerge, and hopefully you knock everyone out so that they couldn't breed and then go lay more eggs. But that's not feasible. That's never going to happen. You're never going to do enough foggings to knock out the entire population. Now, I have seen facilities where it it's very dependent on the facility, but in some cases, you can fog with certain materials that will leave a residual, and depending on the sanitation in those areas, you can get decent control from a fogging, but that's the exception rather than the rule. In general, fogging is going to be one of those situations where either we don't know what we have and we're just doing this to kind of kick the can down the road, or because we've got an auditor that's coming in and we're going to knock that out just so that we get through the audit. Ones where you have actual, like, not in the product infestations, that can lend itself to very effective chemical control, because usually, even let's say we were even dealing with a organic facility, it all the organic products in general, they're going to have little to no residual, meaning they're not going to last very long. And so if I go through with a pyrethrum concentrate and I treat cracks and crevices in an area where I know, say, red flower beetles are hanging out, that's all well and good, but you're not going to get any kind of long-term control, because once that material's dried, it's not that effective anymore. It really has to hit the bug itself in order to kill it. But even if I'm dealing with an organic facility, I can say, we've done X, Y, and Z, and now we need to, we're petitioning CCOF or whoever the particular organic certifier is, to say, we've done all of this stuff. These are the results we've got. We want to use this product that's not on the approved list for X amount of time, and then we're going to pull it off, and we're only going to be treating these specific areas. And in a lot of cases, as long as you justify why you're using it and justify like a very specific area that you're going to apply it to, you can get the auditor to say, okay, we'll approve this, one-time use of this non-organic product. And you can use that to your benefit too. But in those areas where you're doing the spot and crack and crevice, that's going to be where you can use materials that are going to hang around for a good period of time. And that's where you're going to see the best control, because you're actually hitting areas where the larvae are developing. So again, if they live on the food source, you can't treat that. So treating area like the impacted food and expansion joints on or inside machinery, as long as the product says, no product is going to say, oh yeah, go right ahead and treat food contact surfaces and just leave it. At the best case scenario, they're going to say, yeah, you can treat everywhere, but the food contact surfaces need to be thoroughly cleaned off before you resume processing. But then cracks, crevices in storage silos, food debris beneath stock shelves, and if you can focus on those areas, that limits any kind of like it, any little population from staying active for small periods of time and allowing them to reinfest. If you're hitting all of those areas that I just listed, if those do in fact happen to be hot spots, then all right, well, I've knocked out most of the places where they can breed here. Now I'm really focusing on what incoming products are infested, and it allows you to kind of focus on other areas of the supply chain if you've tackled the area in that finished goods part of the facility. So again, getting into the fogging aspect of it's the release of small droplets of liquid by mechanical means, and the droplets have to stay suspended long enough to penetrate harborage. I'll tell you this: if you do, I'm just going to skip forward to this because some people do thermal fogging, or I've heard at least that's much more common, say in like Mexico. I've seen mostly like the cold fogger, the ULV foggers here. That's what I've dealt with more. And in general, that's going to be your best bet for when you're running a fogger through a facility, because the ULV, that's going to be a little bit larger of a droplet size. And one of the things is, if just because you fog an area and you see all of that, quote unquote smoke all over the place, that doesn't mean that material is getting into the areas where the bugs live in an effective dose. Especially if you've got really small droplets, that's subject to however the air is moving around in that facility. And just because you fog an area and you see everything is, enveloped in a fog, that doesn't mean it's getting into the little cracks and crevices where those bugs are. Or if it is getting there, it may not be getting there in enough of a dose in order for it to be effective. And in turn, if they're just picking up sublethal doses of that, that's what leads to insecticide resistance. And then, so it's this kind of, they call it pesticide treadmill, where now you need even more to get rid of the bugs, and it's a cycle. But when do you fall? Really, it's ideally, I would say you focus fogging on when your trap catch numbers hit a certain threshold, and then you go in and fog. But if you're not really collecting that data that well, then maybe scheduled foggings is what you're going to end up dealing with. But I know we're about at time here, and I want to at least leave some time to answer some questions. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Ryan. We have some questions coming in from the audience. The first one is, where can you find updates from the third-party auditors, since they can happen at any time?
That's a good question. All of my information came off of like a little grid thing that I had. So I would say if you're looking for up-to-date stuff, I would go to their website and poke around in there. I don't have a good answer for that, because it's probably been 2 years since I've looked at any of the updates for the auditing bodies. But if you're dealing with them on a regular basis, I would think that, depending on if
is there any audit standard or auditing body that dictates the definite count or trend parameters for infestation threshold levels, such as low, moderate, and heavy?
No, not that I know of. From everything that I've seen, is all of those thresholds are really established by the facility and the pest control company, or if the facility is doing the pest control, just the facility themselves. That's a tough one. If you're collecting really good data, you'll be able to look at previous years and say, okay, well, we noticed we started having a problem on this during this month, and trap catches were about yay high. So we'll say, I don't know, we'll just call it like 15 Indian meal moths per trap per evaluation. If you get that 2 times in a row, or if you get that 1 time, you're like, all right, I'm going to implement, whatever my next step is, which is whether that's additional inspection, inspecting the materials, whether you're going to do a fogging, whatever it is. Those parameters are going to be set at least in my experience, they were always set if the pest control company and the facility, or the facility themselves if they were the ones doing the pest control.
Okay. Are there insect light traps designed for fruit flies?
Uh, I don't believe so. Because I could be wrong on this because they're right in that there are certain wavelengths of light and certain types of light that certain insects are attracted to. Um, and in general, fruit flies, the traps that we would use to catch those are it's got acetic or it's got vinegar in there. Like that's in general what they would be attracted to. Um, so I don't know that there's a fruit fly light specifically. I think if they get into fly lights, I think they just kind of randomly disperse and run into it. I could be wrong. Somebody at Pest West, they make a lot of fly lights. I'm sure somebody there could answer that much more intelligently than me. But just in my experience, I haven't come across a fly light that was designed for fruit flies.
This one says, we have many technicians in our company, but none of them have food plant experience. Is there specific training that you would recommend for a technician to undertake to get them prepared to service third-party audited accounts?
uh, that's a tough one. Because I did the AIB like online course, and it's all well and good. You learn a lot about what's important to a food plant, but in terms of what it teaches you about what you need from the pest control standpoint, that's man, I don't know that there's any specific course, and the only way I learned was it was just being on the job. That's for food plant because if you've never serviced a food plant and you show up there, I mean, it's a daunting. Like if you have no idea what's going on, like thank God when I first showed up, I had supervisors and technicians that knew these facilities inside and out, and they could hold my hand while I kind of figured out what I was doing. But yeah, without that, I would have been lost. So I don't know if there's any particular classes, but yeah, in my experience, it was just having my hand held going around those facilities was the only way I was going to figure it out.
Now this question says, decades ago, I had a lesser grain borer that seemed to be coming out of the particle board cabinets that were previously holding some infested product. Does that sound right?
At, there's nothing that wouldn't sound right with stored product pests. And I say this all the time for any insect pest is, that line in Jurassic Park, life finds a way. That's bugs. Even though I made the point earlier too with the rice weevil, where yeah, they say they really only feed on whole kernels or whole grains, but I found them in finished product. So there's nothing. If a cabinet was holding an infested product and you saw some coming out of there, that very easily could have been the case because wherever little niche they can survive in that has food and an appropriate amount of shelter, they can live. But those bugs are pretty hardy, and they'll figure out ways to survive even with limited resources.
This question says, during the services, when you have presence of wildlife like bats, reptiles, bees, owls, or endangered species, what is the protocol to follow? Do you have some kind of agreement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or does the pest control technician have to do the containment?
Now, that all varies. I'm pretty sure that varies state to state because here in California, you have to have a completely separate license to deal with any. Now, bird and bat exclusion, the technician wouldn't be dealing with that because that's a major construction project that you would undertake. Like my previous company, we had a specific group of people that dealt, especially with like major exclusion in facilities. That was a group that would. Yeah, there was a group that would do that. As it relates to some of the wildlife, some of the other vermin that you might come around. I see this. You may be able to check with vector control districts. Sure. It all depends. Like it depends on what you're trying to get out of there and how you're going to do it. If it's something that's trapping, that's a that's a trapper's license. That's in a lot of cases that's a different company. Like I know we didn't want to get involved with having to deal with the trapping. That was just something we'd say, all right, well, we have a preferred vendor that we would use. Here's their number. So that was a very long-winded way of saying, I'm not really sure. It varies from case to case.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions today. So thank you so much again to Ryan for your presentation and to MGK for sponsoring. And thank you to our attendees for taking some time out of your day to attend.
Thanks, everybody.